Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? She stood in the corner, hands folded lightly, as if she had nowhere important to be. The young Marines laughed among themselves, trading boasts about distances and marksmanship records. None of them looked her way. To them, she was invisible. Worse, she was irrelevant. It wasn't new. Clare Hawkins had grown used to that sort of dismissal. The gray streaks in her hair, the fine lines carved by desert sun and sleepless nights. The posture of someone who'd carried more weight than anyone should. These things made her stand out in a room full of 20-somethings who believed their strength was the only strength worth noticing. But what they didn't know, that was the dangerous part. The sergeant's voice cut through the chatter. Gentlemen, today is about pushing your limits. We're going long 1,500 meters and beyond. Most of you won't hit. That's reality. This is why we train. Chairs scraped, boots thudded, and 5 young men followed Sergeant Williams out to the firing range. Clare trailed behind, silent, her hands buried in the pockets of a jacket that carried no rank, no insignia, just a plain contractor's patch. No reason for them to think she was anything more than a program assistant. Maybe someone brought in to keep the coffee hot or track attendance sheets. That's what Corporal Jensen had assumed earlier. He'd barely glanced up from his phone when he'd pointed at the corner of the room. Ma'am, coffee machine's over there if you need it. Ma'am, that was all they saw. A polite afterthought, a background presence. The wind met them first hard, sharp, relentless. 35 miles an hour and shifting by the minute. Clouds dragged across the sky like torn sails. The range stretched flat and gray, dotted with distant targets so far they looked like flecks of dust. 1,500. Sergeant Williams barked. Rodriguez, you're up. Rodriguez, broad-shouldered and bursting with confidence, stepped to the line. He was 23, every muscle flexed as if he were posing for a camera. A breath heavy, too heavy, finger twitching on the trigger. The shot cracked. The bullet went wide, half a meter off. Wind's not your friend today. Williams said, control it. Rodriguez muttered something under his breath. Martinez laughed. Jensen smirked. Jensen nudged him with an elbow. The energy was competitive, cocky, the kind of arrogance Clare had seen burn holes in battle plans. Martinez stepped up next, quick with his words, quick with his hands, too quick. He rushed the math, squeezed the trigger, and missed clean. Trigger control, Williams said flatly. Again, Clare watched all of it. Every breath, every mistake, every piece of body language. She didn't move, didn't comment. Inside, she cataloged everything. Rodriguez's chest rising too high, Martinez pulling instead of squeezing, Johnson's wrist angled wrong, Jensen smirking like none of it mattered. One by one they failed. The wind chewed up their rounds and spat them aside. The targets stood untouched. 1,800, Williams said. The failures continued. Frustration rose like heat from asphalt. Rodriguez swore under his breath. Martinez cursed at the rifle itself. Jensen accused the optics. Jensen laughed. This is crap. Rodriguez muttered. These rifles are off. Jensen turned, eyes glinting, and locked on Clare. Hey, maybe the old lady wants to try. The others burst into laughter. The sound carried sharp in the cold wind, louder than the rifle cracks. Come on, Jensen, Rodriguez sneered. She's here to observe, not embarrass herself. Clare said nothing at first. She could have looked away. She could have pretended she hadn't heard. But something shifted inside her, the kind of shift that came after years of swallowing. Pride, of letting people underestimate her. This time, she let the silence stretch just long enough to sting. Then she lifted her head. Actually, she said softly, her voice barely cutting the air, I wouldn't mind giving it a shot. The laughter stopped. Williams looked uneasy. Ma'am, he began, this isn't these rifles aren't. For casual use, heavy recoil, dangerous equipment, takes years of training to handle. I understand the risks, Claire said. Jensen smirked. Your funeral, but when you miss, you're buying us beer for a week. And if I hit? He shrugged. That won't happen. Claire smiled, a small, knowing smile. We'll see. When her hands touched the rifle, something shifted. The air seemed to still. The laughter evaporated. The Marines exchanged glances they didn't quite understand. Her posture was suddenly precise, her movements efficient. She didn't fumble, didn't hesitate. The trembling that sometimes came when she held a cup of coffee in the mornings gone. She settled into the prone position, cheek against the stock, breathing low and steady. And then, as her eye found the distant target through the scope, the memories came. Heat, Iraq. The stench of sand and oil fires, cold, Afghanistan. Breath freezing in her throat as snow buried her position. Darkness, jungle shadows, places she couldn't name even now. Each shot in those memories had been a choice. Each one had carved something out of her that she could never put back. Justice against chaos, protection against destruction, and the price always the price. But this shot wasn't about any of that. This was about respect, about teaching, about proving that experience could triumph over arrogance. That wisdom could still carry weight in a world obsessed with youth. The Marines watched, silent now, their bravado thinning like mist. Something about her presence unsettled them. Rodriguez felt his stomach drop. Martinez's smirk faded. Jensen swallowed hard. Jensen fidgeted. Clare adjusted her scope, reading the wind with an instinct that had taken decades to hone. She waited, patient. Still, time stretched. Seconds became long, heavy beats. Then the shot rang out. A crack, a pause, and then impact. 2,000 meters away, the target bore. A single perfect hole. The silence was heavier than the sound had been. None of them spoke. None of them moved. Rodriguez whispered first. That actually happened, right? I didn't imagine that? Martinez's eyes stayed locked on the target. We all saw it. Question is, how the hell did she do it? Jensen pulled out his rangefinder, double-checking the numbers. 2,000. Dead on. With that wind, that's not just good shooting. That's legendary. Jensen felt his chest tighten. The smirk was gone. The arrogance hollowed out. The woman he'd called old lady had just done what none of them could. Something most of them would never do in their careers. His throat was dry, his stomach weak. Sergeant Williams studied her carefully. He saw now what he should have seen before, the economy of her movements. The quiet confidence, the lack of nerves. He knew this wasn't luck. This wasn't a fluke. This was mastery. Ma'am, he said carefully, voice carrying a new weight. Where exactly did you learn to shoot like that? Claire lifted her head from the scope. Her gaze swept across each of them. She saw confusion. She saw awe. And underneath it, fear. Not fear of her. Fear of how wrong they'd been. How blind. Experience, she said quietly. Lots of it. Rodriguez shook his head. But you're just a contractor. Your file. Files don't always tell the whole story. Claire interrupted. Her tone was steady, almost gentle. Sometimes the most important details are the ones that never make it onto paper, Williams's brow furrowed. Something in her bearing nagged at him. Something he'd heard whispered years ago. In the dim light of NCO clubs, in the spaces between deployments, a ghost of a rumor, a story no one believed. Ma'am, he said slowly. What was your call sign? The question hung in the air. Claire hesitated. For a long moment, she considered silence. But then she saw their faces young, arrogant, and now finally open. She knew the answer mattered. Hawkins, she said softly. Claire Hawkins, Williams's face went pale. His hands trembled. His voice was almost a whisper. No, it can't be. Problem, Sergeant? Claire asked. Williams's throat tightened. He could barely form the words. Are you Ghost? The name hit like a bullet. The Marines flinched, as if the sound itself had weight. Even those who didn't know the stories felt it. The way Williams's voice cracked, the way his eyes widened, a legend, a myth whispered in barracks, carried from one generation to the next, a sniper whose impossible shots had turned battles, a shadow who had saved lives without ever being seen. A name no one thought belonged to a real person, Ghost, and she was standing right in front of them. What happens when a myth suddenly stands in front of you? The 5 young Marines stood frozen, their boots rooted to the ground, eyes darting between each other and the woman they had dismissed minutes earlier. Ghost, a name whispered in smoke-filled rooms in the corners of deployments, usually with half a laugh, as if it were just a story, a way to pass time before the next mission. And yet, here she was. Not a ghost, not a myth, flesh and blood, hair streaked gray, eyes sharp, breathing steady. Rodriguez's chest rose and fell like he had just sprinted a mile. Martinez's hands twitched at his sides. Jensen's smirk had drained into something fragile, something bordering on shame. Johnson clung to the only tool he trusted, logic. That doesn't make sense, he muttered. Files don't. Ghost doesn't. That's classified. Exactly. Claire said softly. Williams took a step closer. His voice was low, almost reverent. Ma'am, if you are who I think you are, then you've done things most of us can't even imagine. Claire looked away for a moment, out at the distant horizon where the target still stood. Wind swept across the range, pulling at her jacket. Her silence stretched long enough that Jensen shifted on his feet. Uncomfortable. Then she spoke. What you imagine is probably worse than the truth. Or maybe it's not. That's the problem with legends. They never tell the whole story. The Marines exchanged glances. They wanted details, proof, the inside. Scoop. Their minds raced with rumors. The Kandahar shot, the Syrian hostages, the stories of impossible distances and miraculous saves. But the way Claire's voice carried, a weight laced with regret more than pride, made them hesitate. Rodriguez finally found his voice. How many? He asked. His tone wasn't mocking now. It was barely a whisper. Claire met his gaze. Something in her eyes made him flinch, as though he'd asked a question that cost more than he realized. 347 confirmed, she said quietly. And some that never made it onto any record. Some that aren't written down anywhere. The silence was deafening. Even the wind seemed to pause, giving space to the number. 347. Martinez swallowed hard. Jesus, that's not what matters, Claire. Cut in. Her voice was firm, but not harsh. Numbers don't matter. Files don't matter. What matters is what you carry after, and whether you still recognize the face you see in the mirror. For a moment, none of them knew what to say. These were Marines who lived for achievement, for number scores, distances, kill counts, medals. But Claire was dismantling all of that with a single breath. Williams cleared his throat. His voice cracked slightly. Ma'am, the stories. About Kandahar. About the school. Claire's eyes flicked to him, sharp, warning, but also tired. Some stories are true, she said. Some are stretched. Some are buried because the truth would break you. The words hit harder than any rifle crack. Jensen, who had been the loudest, the cockiest, suddenly looked small. His voice barely rose above the wind. We called you old lady. Claire gave him a faint smile. I've been called worse. But the smile didn't reach her eyes. Johnson, who had been silent too long, finally spoke. Ma'am, if I may ask, what does it feel like, carrying all that? Claire drew in a breath. She hadn't planned to answer, not fully, but the earnestness in his voice, the way it carried not bravado, but curiosity, laced with fear, pulled something loose inside her. Heavy, she said simply. Every shot changes you. Every life you take leaves a shadow. Sometimes it's quick, clean, distant. Other times it's an 8-year-old boy screaming for a father who isn't coming home. And those echoes, they stay with you long after the mission, long after the war. The Marines froze. Unsure how to breathe, Rodriguez broke the silence. So why keep doing it? Why stay in that world? Claire's eyes softened, but her jaw stayed tight. Because sometimes you don't have a choice. Because sometimes if you don't take the shot, someone else dies. And because in the middle of all that, you start to believe maybe you're the only one who can. The weight of her words settled like dust, heavy and unshakable. For the first time since the session began, Martinez didn't have a comeback. Rodriguez's bravado was gone. Jensen stared at the ground. Johnson's logic failed him. Even Williams looked shaken. Clare let the silence linger. She wanted them to sit with it, to feel it, to understand that war wasn't a scoreboard and marksmanship wasn't about ego. Finally, she spoke again, softer this time. Respect matters more than any shot you'll ever take. Respect for your teammates, for your instructors, even for your enemies. Because the moment you start seeing people as less than human, as targets instead of individuals, you lose something you'll never get back. Her words carved into them deeper than any reprimand could have. For a long time, no one spoke. The wind howled, the clouds shifted. The distant targets stood quiet, bearing silent witness. And then, almost as if to break the tension, Jensen lifted his head. His voice trembled. "Ma'am, are you retired because of that? Because of the weight?" Clare exhaled slowly, the breath leaving her chest like she'd been holding it for years. "Partly," she said, "but mostly because I realized teaching might save more lives than pulling a trigger ever could." She gestured at them, 5 young men who had mocked her hours earlier. "Every lesson you take with you could mean a life spared. Every ounce of respect you carry could mean a mission done right. That's worth more than any impossible shot." The Marines shifted, each of them seeing her now in a new light, not as an old woman past her prime, not as a myth come to life, but as someone who had carried burdens they couldn't yet understand. For the first time, their arrogance cracked open into something else, something like humility, something like fear, and maybe, for the first time, they were ready to listen. Have you ever carried a memory so heavy that silence felt safer than words? Clare hesitated before answering the question that had hung in the cold air. Williams had asked about Kandahar. The Marines leaned forward, hungry for proof, for the legend, to step out of rumor and into flesh. But Clare's jaw tightened. Her eyes didn't look at them. They drifted far away past the firing range, past the base, past even the years that separated her from the desert. She let the silence linger, long enough that Martinez shifted uncomfortably. Jensen opened his mouth, then closed it again. Finally, Clare spoke. "Some of the stories you've heard are true. Some aren't, Kandahar." She paused, her voice lowered, as if the name itself carried weight. "That one happened." The Marines froze. She didn't look at them when she spoke. Her eyes stayed on the horizon, but her voice carried images sharper than any scope. School had been taken. Children, dozens of them. We had intelligence they were going to execute them at dawn. To make a point. To show the world what fear looked like. Rodriguez swallowed hard. His arrogance was gone, replaced by something almost childlike. "What did you do?" Claire's voice flattened. "I waited." The Marines exchanged glances. That wasn't the answer they expected. "I spent 18 hours in one position. Heat baking the ground, every bone in my body screaming. But I waited, because one wrong shot meant those kids wouldn't live to see morning. The man holding them, he had to go down first. Clean, quiet, one shot, or everyone died." Her hand brushed the cold barrel of the rifle as if it tethered her to the memory. When the moment came, the window was no bigger than a dinner plate. 2,275 meters. Wind fighting me every second. My finger froze on the trigger. Martinez leaned forward, whispering as though speaking too loud would break the spell. "But you took it." Clare nodded once. Her eyes were distant. He dropped. His guards panicked. Our team moved in. They pulled those children out while the world thought nothing had happened at all. The range was silent. Even the wind seemed to hush. Rodriguez whispered, That's impossible." "No," Claire said softly. "Just costly." The words chilled them more than the story itself. Jensen broke the silence. How do you carry something like that? Knowing you saved them, but knowing what it took." Claire finally looked at him. Her eyes weren't angry. They were tired, because it wasn't the only shot. Every mission, every choice, none of it comes free. You save some, you lose others, and you never forget the ones you couldn't reach. In time, for a moment, the image of a boy's scream flickered across her mind. The one she had spoken of earlier. She pushed it down. Not now, not yet. Williams cleared his throat, steadying himself. His voice was careful. "Ma'am, is it true that you once—" He hesitated, glancing at the Marines before finishing. "That you once stopped an entire squad with a single shot?" Claire's expression darkened. "That one is above your clearance. Let's just say sometimes a bullet placed right can save dozens of lives you'll never meet. Sometimes the cost of inaction is higher than the cost of action." The Marines didn't push. They didn't laugh. They didn't smirk. They listened, and in listening, something shifted. The bravado was gone. The hunger for glory dulled. What filled its place was heavier. Respect, unease, and the dawning realization that war wasn't about medals or myths. Jensen's voice was the one that finally cracked the burst. Silent, small, almost guilty. "We called you old, weak, like you didn't belong here, and we were wrong." Claire's eyes softened for the first time. She gave him a faint nod. "You were wrong. But don't apologize to me. Learn from it. Treat the next person better. That's how respect works. Not words, actions." The words hit Jensen harder than any reprimand. He dropped his eyes, his jaw tight. For once, he had nothing clever to say. Claire stood, brushing dirt from her jacket. She looked at the five of them, their young faces, their unsettled eyes, the arrogance peeling away. She saw pieces of herself in them. Once, long ago, she'd been just as certain, just as hungry. But war had taught her lessons they couldn't yet understand. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice steady, "we start over. No legends, no myths, just training. If you want to learn, I'll teach you. But you have to leave the arrogance behind. Out here, arrogance doesn't just get you killed. It gets everyone killed." They nodded, quiet, serious. As they gathered their gear, Martinez glanced at Rodriguez. For once, neither had a joke. Johnson's face was unreadable, but his hands no longer shook with confidence. They shook with something like fear. Jensen lingered, stealing glances at Clare as if trying to reconcile the myth with the woman standing before him, and Williams. Williams looked at her with something close to reverence. But when Clare turned back to the horizon, her thoughts weren't on them. They were far away, with ghosts of her own. Because no matter how many lessons she could teach, no matter how much respect she could demand, some memories never loosened their grip. Some shadows never left. What's the most dangerous mistake a soldier can make? The question hung in the morning air as Clare stood before the five young Marines. The range stretched quiet behind her. The wind softer today, carrying only the faint smell of cordite from the previous day's shots. Rodriguez, the first to speak, answered fast. Hesitation. Clare shook her head. "No." Martinez smirked. Quick as always. Bad aim. "No." Jensen, arms crossed, offered his guess. "Poor planning. Closer, but not it." Jensen, quiet now, studied her carefully before speaking. His voice lacked the usual edge. "Arrogance?" Claire's eyes softened. "That's the one." The Marines exchanged glances. None of them argued. "Not after yesterday. Arrogance blinds you," Clare continued. "It makes you misread people, underestimate them, dismiss what you should be. Listening to it kills faster than bullets. And once you've learned that lesson in the field, she paused, letting the silence carry the weight. Sometimes it's too late to recover. They shifted uncomfortably. Today, she said, you'll learn how to see. She led them to the observation tower that overlooked the range. From here, the targets looked small, scattered dots across a sea of grass and dirt. But Claire didn't hand them rifles. She handed them binoculars. Spotting drill? Jensen asked. Not exactly. For the next hour, she made them sit in silence. No shots, no talking, just watching. At first, the Marines fidgeted. Rodriguez tapped his boot. Martinez muttered under his breath. Jensen sighed loudly. Even Williams checked his watch twice. But Claire didn't move, didn't speak. She sat perfectly still, scanning the landscape like it was alive. Observation isn't just about targets, she finally said. It's about people, patterns, motions, the things others miss. You can tell a lot about someone by how they breathe, how they shift their... Wait, how long they hold silence before they speak. Out here, those details mean the difference between a clean mission and a body bag. The words settled on them heavier than the rifles they weren't holding. Rodriguez finally asked, so, what are we supposed to be seeing? Claire smiled faintly. That's the point, you tell me. Hours passed, slowly, reluctantly. The Marines began to notice. Rodriguez pointed out a bird circling overhead, marking where carrion might be. Martinez caught the way the grass bent, showing shifts in the wind. Jensen saw glimmers of light off distant metal reflections he'd overlooked at first. Jensen, the youngest, surprised them all when he finally whispered, there are tracks, Faint. Someone crossed the ridgeline before we got here. Claire nodded. Good. Now you're starting to see. It wasn't about shooting. Not yet. It was about patience. Presence, humility. That night, as they cleaned weapons in the barracks, Claire shared another fragment of her past. Not all of it. Just enough to keep the silence heavy. Fallujah, 2004. Her voice was calm, but her hands paused briefly over the rifle's bolt. I had a shot, perfect, clean, high-value target. But something was wrong. The Marines leaned in. The man was alone, too alone. No guards, no weapons visible. Every instinct screamed. It was too easy. So I waited. For 3 hours, I waited. Finally, I saw it. The real target. The first man was bait, a decoy to draw out snipers like me. She looked at them, one by one. If I'd taken that shot, I'd have killed an innocent man and revealed my position, and I wouldn't be standing here talking to you. Rodriguez shook his head slowly. So patience saved you. Patience saved a lot more than me. Claire said, it saved the mission. It saved the men who trusted me to do my job. Sometimes the bravest choice isn't pulling the trigger. It's waiting. It's knowing when not to shoot. Her words clung to them like smoke. Later, after lights out, Jensen lay awake in his bunk. The others had drifted into uneasy sleep, but his mind replayed her voice. The shot you don't take. He thought about every moment he'd mocked her, every assumption, every glance he'd given that said you don't belong here. He hated himself. For now, the next morning, Claire brought them back to the range. Yesterday you learned to see. Today you learn patience. She placed a single target at extreme distance. Then she handed Rodriguez the rifle. One shot, she said. Take as long as you need. But if you rush it, you fail. Rodriguez grinned. Determined to prove himself, he aimed fast, squeezed, and missed. Claire's voice was calm. Failure isn't missing. Failure is rushing. She turned to Martinez. Your turn. Martinez took longer, calculated, adjusted, but still missed. Patience. Claire said again. Jensen tried, closer. Still off. When it was Jensen's turn, he froze. Hands tight on the rifle, eyes straining through the scope. He remembered her words. Every shot changes you. Make sure it's worth it. He took a breath, then another. He waited. Minutes dragged on. The others grew restless. But Clare only watched. Silent, finally, Jensen squeezed. The bullet tore the air and struck dead center. The others gasped. Jensen lifted his head, wide-eyed. As though he didn't quite believe it himself, Clare smiled. This time, it reached her eyes. That's what patience looks like. For the first time, Jensen felt something shift inside. Him, not pride, not arrogance, something deeper, respect, and for Clare. Watching him lower the rifle, a thought flickered unbidden. Maybe teaching really can save more lives than shooting ever did. But even as the hope warmed her, the shadows of old missions pressed at the edges of her mind. Faces she couldn't forget, screams that still haunted her sleep. Lessons she hadn't yet taught them, because some truths cut deeper than bullets. And soon, those truths would demand to be told. Have you ever wished you could take back a single moment, knowing it would follow you for the rest of your life? Clare didn't plan to share it. Some memories were safer locked away, buried under years of silence. But as she sat with the young Marines that evening, their rifles disassembled on the table, the air heavy with the smell of gun oil, she saw something in their faces that she hadn't seen before. They weren't waiting for myths anymore. They weren't hungry for war stories to brag about. They were searching for truth, the kind that scars you, the kind that stays. So she gave it to them. Afghanistan 2010. Her voice was quiet, measured, almost reluctant. The target was a Taliban commander, high value, ruthless. We knew he was responsible for dozens of ambushes. We tracked him for weeks. Finally, we had a window. The Marines leaned closer, silent. I had the shot lined up. Perfect. Clean. No wind. No obstacles. I took it. She stopped. For a moment. The only sound was the clink of Martinez setting down a cleaning rod too hard. The faint hum of the barracks' overhead light. But what I didn't know, Clare continued, her voice cracking just slightly, was that his 8-year-old son was nearby. He came running into the courtyard seconds after, screaming, clutching his father's body. The room froze. Clare looked down at her hands. They trembled faintly, though her voice stayed steady. That child's scream has never left me. I can still hear it, every night. Sometimes I think it's quieter, but then it comes back, louder. Rodriguez's throat worked as he tried to swallow. Johnson stared at the table, jaw clenched. Martinez's usual smirk was long gone. Jensen looked like he wanted to say something, but couldn't. I told myself it was necessary, Clare said. That commander would have killed more, maybe hundreds, maybe children just like that boy. But logic doesn't erase a sound. Logic doesn't erase eyes that look at you like you destroyed their world. The silence in the room deepened. Even Sergeant Williams, hardened by years of deployments, lowered his head. Ma'am. Jensen's voice cracked. What do you do with that? With the guilt? Clare's eyes lifted slowly, meeting his. For a moment, she saw not the cocky young Marine who had mocked her days earlier, but a boy searching for a truth no training manual could provide. You don't get rid of it, she said. You carry it. You learn from it. You let it remind you that every decision matters, that every pull of the trigger changes lives far beyond the scope. If you forget that, if you let yourself stop feeling it, you become something less than human. Johnson whispered, almost to himself. So the price of being ghost is never being free. Clare didn't answer. She didn't need to. The truth was in her eyes. The Marines sat in silence, their arrogance gone, their illusions cracked. They weren't just listening to a sniper's story anymore. They were staring into the abyss that comes with power, the cost of pulling a trigger at the right time, in the right place, for the right reason. Williams finally broke the silence. His voice was rough. Ma'am, is that why you're here now? Why you're teaching us? Clare nodded. I can't change the past, but maybe I can change the future. Maybe if I can teach you 5 to see differently, to respect differently, to choose differently, then fewer. Screams will echo in your heads. Her words landed heavy, like a verdict, Rodriguez rubbed the back of his neck, ashamed. We thought this was about bragging rights, about who could hit the farthest target. It never was, Claire said softly. Shooting is only part of the job. The rest is psychology, patience, and knowing when not to shoot. Martinez raised his head. When not to shoot? Claire's gaze sharpened. When innocent lives are at risk, when there's another way, when the cost outweighs the gain. Sometimes the greatest strength isn't in the shot you take, it's in the one you refuse. Her words carved into them, deeper than any drill ever could. That night, long after Clare left the room, the 5 young Marines sat in silence. No one cracked a joke. No one boasted about distance or skill. Jensen lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing the faint echo of a scream that wasn't even his memory. Rodriguez gripped his hands together until his knuckles went white. Martinez, for the first time in his life, had no words. Jensen cleaned his rifle again and again. Though it was already spotless, William stared at the floor, the image of a legend humanized. Broken, yet still standing, Clare, alone in her quarters, sat by the window. Outside, the training grounds stretched under the night sky. Empty and quiet, she rested her head against the cool glass, her reflection staring back at her. Sometimes, she thought dignity doesn't speak. It simply endures. But as she closed her eyes, the boy's scream returned. It always did. And she wondered, not for the first time, if teaching these young men would be enough to silence it. What if the real lesson wasn't in the rifle at all? At dawn, the Marines assembled on the range, rifles slung, eyes sharper than they'd been just days ago. The arrogance had thinned. Respect had crept in, though it felt strange to them new. Unsteady, like boots not yet broken in, Claire stood before them, hands clasped behind her back. She didn't carry a rifle today, only her presence, steady as stone. Today, she said, we don't fire a single round. The Marines exchanged glances. Rodriguez frowned. Martinez smirked. Though it didn't quite reach his eyes, Jensen bit his lip, waiting. Claire let their discomfort sit before she continued. Anyone can pull a trigger. You've already proven that. But shooting is maybe 20% of a sniper's life. The rest? She paused. The rest is discipline, patience, observation, knowing when not to act. And that's what we'll train today. She led them away from the firing line, past the observation tower, to a stretch of scrubland where the earth broke, into ridges and gullies. This, she said, gesturing at the terrain, is where you'll spend most of your life. Not behind sandbags, not in perfect prone positions. Out here, with dirt in your mouth, wind in your face, and the enemy waiting for you to make a single mistake. They dropped into the brush. For the next 2 hours, Claire forced them to crawl. Not sprint, not shoot, crawl, inch by inch. The Marines struggled. Rodriguez cursed under his breath. Body too bulky for the narrow gullies. Martinez rushed, drawing her quiet correction every time he moved too fast. Jensen calculated every movement, but wore himself out overthinking. Jensen tried, really tried, but impatience pulled at him like gravity. Claire, though, moved like the earth itself was her ally. Smooth, silent, invisible. Slow down. She called softly. Every breath you waste makes you louder. Every shift of your elbow tells a story. Out there, you want to tell no stories. They tried. Again and again, until sweat soaked through their uniforms, until dirt caked their faces, until even their arrogance gave up and surrendered to exhaustion. Finally, when they collapsed into the dust, Claire knelt beside them. You think this is punishment. It's not. It's survival. If you can't slow your body, you'll never slow your mind. And if you can't slow your mind, you'll pull the trigger when you shouldn't. The lesson sank deep, not all at once, but they felt it. That night, under the dim glow of barracks lights, Claire shared another memory, not as a story of glory, but as a warning. I once waited 14 hours for one shot, she said quietly. cleaning her rifle with practiced hands. 14 hours, my body cramped, my eyes burned. But when the target finally stepped into view, that one shot saved 30 American lives. If I'd moved too soon, if I'd given in to impatience. She shook her head. There wouldn't have been anyone left to save. The Marines absorbed her words in silence. Rodriguez, who once lived for speed and muscle, now nodded slowly. Martinez, who thrived on quick wit, bit his tongue. Jensen, who worshipped numbers, began to see limits to calculation. And Jensen, the cocky voice of the group, felt the truth dig under his skin. Patience wasn't weakness. It was power. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm that was nothing like the training they expected. Observation drills that felt like meditation. Movement exercises that stripped their pride bare. Discussions that sounded less like lectures and more like parables. Observation isn't just about spotting an enemy, Clare told them one morning. It's about people, your teammates, civilians, locals. If you can't read the room, you'll fail in the field. Because not every enemy carries a weapon, and not every ally wears your uniform. She told them about an Iraqi boy who'd approached a unit, eyes wide with fear. Some Marines had dismissed him. She hadn't. The boy turned out to be a source of intelligence that saved the entire convoy from an ambush. Observation saved. U.S., she said. Not bullets. Another day. She walked them through patience again. Sometimes your instincts tell you to shoot. But instincts can lie. Trust them. But test them. If something feels too easy, wait. Time reveals what impatience hides. She spoke of the Fallujah decoy, the bait that could have killed her if she'd rushed. The Marines listened differently. Now, not as fans of a legend, but as students grasping the sharp edge of truth. On the fourth night, Martinez finally cracked. He leaned forward during the quiet of weapon cleaning and whispered, "Ma'am, you said shooting is only 20%. What's the other 80? Claire's hands stilled. She set the bolt carefully on the table, then looked at each of them. The other 80, she said, is humanity, understanding people, reading situations, knowing when violence will solve a problem and when it will only make it worse, building relationships, keeping your mind steady when everything else collapses, and most of all," she paused, her voice dropping softer, "finding a way to come home with your soul still intact." The words pressed into them like weight. Rodriguez finally broke the silence. "That's not what we were expecting." Clare gave a faint smile. "That's the point. War isn't what you expect, and if you think it is, you'll learn too late." They fell silent again, each lost in thought. For Clare, the silence was heavier, because while she spoke of humanity, of patience, of restraint, her own mind returned to the faces of those she couldn't save, the screams that no training could erase. Teaching gave her hope, but it didn't quiet the ghosts, not yet. And as she lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, she wondered whether these 5 Marines would learn enough, not just to survive war, but to survive themselves, because the battlefield might break their bodies. But arrogance, impatience, and disrespect, those could break their souls long before the bullets ever reached them. What do you want them to remember when you're gone? That question had been circling in Claire's mind for weeks, but it pressed harder as she watched the 5 Marines on the range that morning. They weren't the same boys who had mocked her. When she first arrived, something in their posture had changed, in their silence, in their eyes. Rodriguez crouched low, breathing steady, his body no longer straining to show strength but flowing with control. Martinez moved slower now, his quick tongue replaced by quick observation. Jensen calculated less, trusted more. Jensen, the one who once smirked at everything, waited longer than anyone before pulling his trigger. And Williams, who had once seen her as an unnecessary addition to his program, now watched with the quiet respect of a man who understood how little he really knew. They weren't perfect, but they were listening, really listening. Clare stood behind them, arms folded, letting them work through the drill without interruption. When Jensen finally fired, hitting just left of center, she nodded. Not because of the hit, but because of the patience it had taken to get there. Better, she said softly. The Marines turned, waiting for correction, for critique. But Clare only studied them for a long moment before asking a question of her own. What's the most important shot you'll ever take? Rodriguez straightened, eager to answer. The one that saves lives, Martinez added quickly. The one that hits clean, Johnson offered. The one that ends the fight. Jensen hesitated. He looked at her carefully. The one you don't take? Claire's lips curved into the faintest smile. Now you're learning. The others glanced at Jensen. Surprised, he shifted uncomfortably, but the truth was sinking into them all. Every shot changes you, Clare continued. Not just the ones that land, not just the ones you miss. Every decision to act or not act carves something out of you. And the real measure of a soldier isn't distance or accuracy or numbers. It's whether you can live with what you've done when the rifle is finally quiet. Her voice grew softer, because someday it will be quiet, and you'll still be here, alone with yourself. The Marines looked at her differently now, not as a contractor, not even as Ghost, but as someone who had lived through the silence they feared, and had found a way broken, scarred, but still standing. That night, in the barracks, Rodriguez spoke first. Ma'am, back when you made that 2,000-meter shot, what were you thinking? What was it for? Clare cleaned the rifle in her lap, her movements slow. It wasn't for pride or records. It was for respect. To remind you that experience matters, that wisdom can't be measured by age or rank. That arrogance dies fast in the wind. Martinez frowned. But didn't it also prove something about you? Clare paused. The truth was complicated. She had wanted to prove something, wanted to shatter the dismissive smirks, the laughter, the way Jensen had called her old lady. But deeper than that, it hadn't been about herself. It proved that prejudice blinds us, she said finally. That the person you dismiss might be the one who saves you, and that the quietest presence in the room may carry the loudest truth. Her words silenced them. Jensen shifted in his chair, restless. Then he blurted out, Ma'am, I need to say it. I disrespected you. I laughed at you. And if I could take it back. Clare stopped him with a raised hand. Don't apologize to me. Show respect to the next person you're tempted to dismiss. That's how you make it right. The young Marine's throat tightened, but he nodded. For the first time, his respect wasn't born of fear. It was real. Williams cleared his throat. Ma'am, if I may ask, any regrets? The question hung heavy. Clare set the rifle down, hands resting on her knees. Her gaze drifted to the window, where night had settled like a blanket over the base. She thought of Kandahar, of Fallujah, of the Afghan boy's scream. Yes, she said at last, regrets that will never leave me. Missions where I saved many but lost one. Moments where the shot was perfect, but the cost was unbearable. If you go long enough in this life without regrets, you're lying to yourself, or you've stopped seeing the people behind the targets. The room grew still. Rodriguez, usually the loudest, spoke quietly. So what keeps you going? Clare turned her eyes back to them. Teaching, because if I can pass on wisdom instead of bullets, maybe I can change the math. Maybe the echoes will quiet. Maybe you won't make the same mistakes I did. Her voice softened. That's the only redemption I believe in anymore. The Marines sat in silence, each man carrying her words into places he hadn't dared look before. Clare leaned back, her body aching with years of strain, but her eyes steady. She had spent decades ending lives. Now, with these 5 young men, she was trying to save them, not from enemies, not from battles, but from themselves. Because she knew the truth. The hardest war wasn't fought in deserts or mountains. It was fought in silence. After the gunfire stopped, and if she could prepare them for that war, then maybe, just maybe, her ghosts would finally rest. What do you say at the end of a life built on silence? Clare stood at the podium, the Marine Corps' emblem shining behind her. the weight of 25 years pressing on her shoulders. Rows of uniforms stretched before her young recruits in crisp blues. Seasoned officers with ribbons on their chests, faces both familiar and strange. And in the front row, 5 Marines stood at attention. Rodriguez, Martinez, Jensen, Jensen, and Williams. Her students, her proof, a redemption. For a moment, Clare didn't speak. She let the silence settle, let the restless coughs fade, let the weight of the occasion hang heavy in the hall. She'd spent her life speaking only when necessary. Today would be no different. I've spent 25 years learning to take shots. She began, her voice steady, carrying across the crowd. 347 confirmed. Some at distances that seemed impossible. Some that history will never know about. A murmur rippled through the audience, but Clare raised a hand, silencing it. But those numbers aren't what matter. The greatest shot I ever made wasn't at 2,000 meters, or across a desert, or through a window the size of a plate. The greatest shot I ever made was here, 10 feet away, when I chose to teach instead of walking away from 5 young Marines who thought they knew everything. The front row shifted, pride and shame mingling on their faces. Clare smiled faintly, not unkind. Those 5 men became my mirror, she said. They reminded me of who I was, and who I didn't want them to become. They carried arrogance, impatience, disrespect, the same flaws I once carried myself, and through them, I realized something I wish I'd learned earlier. That strength isn't measured in targets eliminated, but in lives protected, in respect shown, in dignity carried quietly. The hall was silent now. Every breath held. She looked across the room, her eyes pausing on the youngest recruits. War will test you. It will break pieces of you. You'll come home carrying ghosts you never wanted. And when you do, the medals won't matter. The records won't matter. What will matter is whether you treated people with respect, whether you listened when you should have, whether you chose restraint when the easier choice was violence. Her voice softened, threading through the silence like a prayer. Because the most important lessons aren't in the shot you take. They're in the ones you don't. They're in the patience to wait, the humility to learn, the courage to see others as human, even when the world tells you not to. She glanced again at her 5 Marines. Jensen's eyes were wet, though he stood rigid. Rodriguez's jaw clenched, his chest rising with emotion he couldn't swallow. Martinez's smirk was gone, replaced by reverence. Jensen looked down, deep in thought. Williams stood taller than ever, pride etched into his posture. Clare drew a steady breath. Here's what I want you to remember. Every person you meet, regardless of age, background, appearance, has something to teach you. Your job isn't to prove you're better than them. Your job is to find the lesson they carry. Because the moment you stop learning from others is the moment you stop growing as a soldier and as a human being. The silence that followed was different now. Not heavy with regret, but full of respect. Clare allowed herself one last smile. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. Remember that, and pass it on. The applause thundered, filling the hall, echoing off the walls like rolling fire. But Clare barely heard it. She looked at the faces in the crowd, at the 5 Marines who had once dismissed her and now stood as her assistants, ready to carry her lessons into the world. Her mission was complete. Not the missions in deserts and mountains, not the impossible shots whispered about in legends, not even the confirmed numbers etched in secret files. This was her legacy. As the ceremony ended and the crowd dispersed, Jensen approached her one last time. His voice was quiet. Reverend, ma'am, thank you for everything, for showing us that wisdom doesn't announce itself, that sometimes the quietest person in the room carries the loudest truth. Clare placed a hand on his shoulder. Remember that, Sergeant. Pass it on, and never forget. The person you're most tempted to dismiss might be the one who saves your life. He nodded, eyes burning, and then she walked away from the uniform, from the rifle, from the shadow of Ghost. Her steps were steady. Her head was high. The applause faded. The whispers dimmed. The legend dissolved, but the lesson remained, because in the end, Clare Hawkins' story was never about impossible shots or battlefield legends. It was about quiet dignity, about unseen strength, about the courage to carry ghosts and still choose to teach. And somewhere, in classrooms and training grounds and barracks across the world, her words would live on, reminding soldiers, leaders, and anyone willing to listen that wisdom often hides in the most unexpected places. Sometimes in the corner, sometimes behind gray hair and weathered hands, sometimes in the silence that everyone else ignores, and sometimes in the person they once called Old Lady.